counter-hegemonic understanding of the world. They had to live in the world imposed upon them by the church and by the king and or the emperor or whatever. And that ratified their subject position. And so you see, like, the Gnostics and the Anabaptists and the Cathars and the fucking Hutterites and all trying to build collective life. I mean, it's not a coincidence that the great German peasants' revolt happens just a few years after the nailing of the theses in the Wittenberg Cathedral. There was a drive to make Christianity the social, the expressed social reality, to have it match, to have the social reality of living in Christianity match the vision of universal brotherhood. Now, of course, it was cramped and wrong because you could feel the alienation for the system and fight against it, but only using the vocabulary of your rulers. The creation of capitalism, the creation of this ever-increasing pool of proletarianized people who are forced to live together and struggle in the same conditions, creates not just disillusionment with the system and the feeling of oppression, but also solidarity. And Marx is saying every previous resistance to a regime of power ends in collapse or domination of one by the other because they're all fighting with the cultural tools in the sandbox. They were in hermetically sealed hegemonies. So they could only recreate regimes of control because that's all they knew. Capitalism creates an antithesis, a fundamental antithesis, as in a whole new world. Don't you dare close your eyes. With a different religious understanding, where religiosity and sociality are fused, and technology, the technology of mass media, and consolidation of labor power into machines allows you to actually express it. The reason that those efforts to create a just Christendom failed is because the tools to distribute resources equitably didn't exist. There was not sufficient concentrated capital around means of production to do that. When the Anabaptists took Munster, they basically just hung around and waited for the world to end because none of them had any ability to create a functioning economy. And so they ended up just waiting for the world to end. And then it did when the emperor came and killed all of them. Because that was the one red line in the Reformation. The Reformation threw most of the deeply held notions of the Western Catholic Church into question. The one that couldn't be questioned was infant baptism, even though one of the chief objections of Protestantism was that the Catholic Church did a bunch of shit that wasn't in the Bible. They made a bunch of shit up, and that was wrong because the Bible is the only true authority. Everything else is fallen and deformed by man. But infant baptism isn't in the fucking Bible. But what infant baptism was not a baptism into a religion. It was a baptism into a social world, a hierarchy. And to say, I get to be baptized as an adult, I get to choose to enter this community, is to challenge the entire social order. But it couldn't work because there wasn't sufficient social technology or economic technology around to redistribute labor effectively. We are at that point. We are past the point where capitalism has created the means to allow a socially coherent working class with its own internal machines, technologies of belief, adhering people to a project at the center of the technological nexus, at the nodes of power, able to turn the knobs. You could do it. We could do it. It would essentially be humans taking over the machine from the algorithm. And then building a world where Nothing is privately owned, but nothing is rented either. Like, provision for life is taken for granted, and your participation in the world with others, the building, the making of an economy, the distribution of resources, the building of a culture, the managing of those things is not participating in a market out of self-interest, out of homo economicus desire to maximize profit for myself and to hoard surplus to enjoy materially, but is a spiritual communion with a social organism. And that sounds crazy, wacky, crazy, insane, but I swear to God it isn't. The thing that makes it seem insane is the idea that we all have as a lodestone around our neck is human nature, which is just the secularized version of original sin. It is capitalism. It is secular capitalism's recapitulation at the social level of belief in capitalism. Just as original sin was the functioning structure, is the defining mental structure that adhered one to the society of orders in the Christian West. I am fallen. I have sinned. Therefore, I must accept my lot. It's essentially a westernized version of the caste idea. Your position in life is determined by your worthiness. But all are fallen. But what, of course, is making you fall is living under these conditions, the reproduced social exploitation of a class society, where bad is called good, where you literally live in a matrix of ideology that turns virtue into vice and vice versa. Now, we killed God. We can't tell you that you are where you are because God wants you to be there, because nobody really believes in God anymore. Well, what they do believe in is that they're human beings and that they're in a natural order. Well, part of that natural order is the idea that humans are wired to self-seek at the expense of other people. And that's why we can't do what I talked about. You can't create socialized structures of economic power because they'll just be hoarded by the mob and selfishly used by elites who then use their position to exploit everybody else. Yeah, if we did that, yes, that's what would happen. But we wouldn't do that. The people doing that machine, the people operating that social machinery are not us. They have been transformed over time and struggle. Because you don't get that immediately. That's the result of a fucking long human organizational task. The best example of this would be the Cuban Revolution. One of the reasons that Cuba has survived in the form it has without becoming a cult of personality terror state like North Korea, sorry haters, but that's what it is, was by building faith in the system. And that means not just people who are subject to the system, but the people who administer the system. That doesn't mean there's no corruption in Cuba. It doesn't mean it's perfect. What it means is the corruption and the exploitation are not so vast as to alienate the population at a mass scale in a way that can't be managed with the escape valve of immigration. Of course, the conditions of that exploitation and that corruption are economic deprivation. If you have post-scarcity, plus if you have a post-scarcity context, and you have sufficient technology to distribute uncomfortable labor away from the human experience, and people actually have values that are outside of the guilt matrix of living in capitalism, feeling either guilt or resentment at all times and having to do something with that resentment or guilt, that combination that everybody is filled with at all times under capitalism, that everybody is filled with, I should say, at all times under class or rule. The class system is bifurcated, and that means everybody is guilty of exploitation or is a victim of exploitation. But of course, because this is a very complicated social organism, this is a gradient. This is not just at some point there's an inflection, but there is a gradient, and there's a middle category of people who are both. And everybody feels guilt and resentment in some marbling. The more powerful you are, the more it's just plain guilt. And of course, some of the richest people in the world are incredibly resentful, but of course that is resenting people for making them feel guilt. And of course, at the very bottom, what do you have to feel guilty about other than the personal guilt of committing harm to people around you, which happens a lot more when you're fucking miserable all the time. It is a parasitic relationship, and it's no good for either side. It is bad for your soul. And so your interaction with the world becomes selfish and dedicated to ignoring that feeling. And the only thing to ignore it with is that which can be purchased in the market, either in the form of direct consumption or social standing elevation, which you get to feel good about, and the pursuit of social standing. Now, out of this sandwich of pain and resentment is forged the socialist movement. But it has to struggle in the context of capitalism as part of a caste society. When communism finally happens in the Soviet Union, it is not in the context of world revolution and the seizure of the means of production at the center that Lenin and Trotsky imagined, but in the isolation of a economically backward, feudal world that then had to confront and compete with capitalism on its terms from a position of deep deficits. And it did the job, as people have said, miracle. But it did kill millions of people to make it happen. You cannot deny that. And the reality of that is that it makes the project less believable to people who live through that and the people that they give birth to and raise. It disillusions the necessary social belief that powers communism is undermined. And no one in the social Bolshevik party at the top would have supported the October Revolution if they thought they'd had to go it alone. I would challenge anybody who disagrees with that. They would not have done it if they thought they had to go it alone, because they all knew what that would require. It would require war on the peasantry. Because turning an agricultural population into an urban one is a violent, horrifying process that capitalism had carried out in the rest of the world, either through enclosure and violence, labor violence at the center, or through colonization from outside. This is the first time that communism is asked to do this violent work. And yes, it does it, and it beats the Nazis. But by the 50s, they're left with the task of trying to compete with the West to create a consumer economy after they have lost the faith of the people. They say, look, we're just a state like other states. We're an elite. But we can give you a better standard of living than you can get in the West. You can give you more stuff. And the thing is, the stuff that they could give them that we couldn't give our people, like guaranteed health care, guaranteed housing and employment, in a position of social alienation, in a context of social alienation, that's not what people need. That's not what people notice missing. Because in the West, where capitalism has, where the hegemonic processes of capitalism have recreated our social order and our understanding of our place in society, we don't feel entitled to those things. We feel like those are rewards too. What the state is in charge of is all the pleasures. What the state is in charge of is whether or not we can access consumer convenience, because that is our only acceptable form of relief from the anguish of capitalism. We can do drugs. Some of those are legal, and you can contribute to the economy by buying them. Others aren't, and you can contribute to the intelligence community by buying those. But mostly, you have to buy things. And the government's job is to allow you to buy as much stuff as possible and give you the opportunity to contribute, or to the opportunity to compete in a market, not only for stuff, but for status. And with that question, with that as the modus operandi for society, hey, we're gonna have you guys we are gonna have you guys work in factories, and then we're gonna give you stuff. But in the East, you're going to believe that you are a public. You are working for the state, and then the state gives you some shitty fucking appliances, and they have deep scarcity because they have a much smaller reservoir of raw materials and a less developed industry than the East does. And half of it got blown up by World War II. They had to start from scratch practically in a lot of the country. The United States' industrial heartland was untouched and, in fact, massively expanded by the war. But in the West, you work hard for yourself. Yes, you have a boss, but you are earning money. You're not working for the state. And then you can take that money and buy things. And you can buy more things than your neighbor. And if you work harder, you can buy even more things. You're not going to win that contest. You can't. That is why somebody said, and I forgot to even mention it because I got sidetracked, but at the beginning of the very beginning of the chat, somebody asked,